Hello, it's Senator Ben Cardin. Welcome to Facebook Live, an opportunity that I take advantage of about every week or so to communicate with the people of Maryland on an issue that is timely being considered by the United States Senate. I must tell you, I don't think there's a more timely issue or a more important issue than our discussion today, dealing with voting rights and for the people. We have seen efforts being made in state legislatures around the nation to make it more challenging for individuals to be able to cast their votes. They're doing this in response to the 2020 election, which was, by all accounts, one of the most successful elections in voter turnout in the history of America. We had more voter participation than we ever had, and that's during a pandemic, during a health pandemic, and yet we were able to allow people to vote safely. By every account, the amount of voter fraud was minuscule, and individuals had a chance to express who they wanted to represent them, not only in the White House, but in the Congress and in the state governments around the nation. And it was an election that employed opportunities for people to vote in person, to vote by mail, to vote by Dropbox, to bring it in. All of that was available in many states during the 2020 elections. But now we have state legislatures that are trying to change that. There's been legislation introduced in the House and in the Senate. I'm proud that my Congressman John Sarbanes, is the lead sponsor of the H.R. 1, which is for the People Act that passed the United States House of Representatives. In the Senate, we're considering S1, the comparable legislation, and that's currently under debate in the United States Senate. So I have two real experts on this subject with us today to lead us in this discussion. Jana Morgan is the director of the Declaration for American Democracy. I'm going to have her explain exactly what that coalition is about so you can understand how it came about and the organizations that are part of it. And we have Virginia Kase Solomon, who is the CEO of the League of Women Voters, an organization that's celebrating its 100 years of being in existence, an organization that is known for sticking to its mission since its inception, which is good governance. Give the people the opportunity to express themselves and have input, and being very careful against any type of partisanship. So I hope, Virginia, you'll keep me in line today because I get pretty emotional about the right to vote. And if I cross the line on partisanship, I know you'll bring me back to where I need to be. So, Jana, if I could start with you, tell me about the Declaration for American Democracy, how it came about, and who's part of it, and what your mission is all about.
Sure, happy to. And thank you so much, Senator Cardin, for inviting me to speak on this great live stream today. So fair representation in our government will ensure that we all have an equal voice in key issues affecting our country, like the environment, economy, education, racial justice, and healthcare. And to make progress on all the critical issues facing our country, we first have to realize the promise of our American democracy and ensure that our leaders govern in our name and in our interests, not just for the rich and powerful. And so our coalition, the Declaration for American Democracy, came together for just that reason, to advance a bill, the For the People Act, which we think will create a domino effect and achieve rapid progress on the issues that people care most about. And the Declaration for American Democracy has over 220 organizational members representing millions of Americans from the civil rights, labor, racial justice, faith, business, women's rights, environmental, good government, and many other important communities. And our coalition is unique in that it brings together organizations and leaders across multiple sectors, across multiple issue areas, to demand with one voice a democratic system that reflects, responds to, and represents all of us.
And Virginia, first, I really want to thank you for your roots in our state of Maryland. You're a proud graduate of the University of Maryland. I always give a shout out to the University of Maryland when I can. And of course, you were very active with Kase de Maryland, one of the great institutions in our state. It now has just a great facility in Baltimore, in addition to its location in the Washington suburbs. So you've been serving the people of Maryland for a long time, and we appreciate it very much. You now have the responsibility as the CEO of the League of Women Voters. Tell us a little bit about how the League of Women Voters approach an issue like this, voting rights, which has been partisan, at least in this election cycle, an organization that is known as being nonpartisan.
Thank you so much, Senator Cardin. I just want to say, first of all, how great it's been to have you as a partner and champion, not only in this work, but representing our great state of Maryland. It really just is an honor to be here today. The League, the League has been around. We just celebrated our 101st anniversary, and we work around the clock every year to do two things: to empower voters and defend democracy. It's unfortunate that nowadays we've been doing more of the defense work around democracy. But for us, that means making sure voters have the accurate and trusted nonpartisan information they need to cast their ballot. We never endorse candidates or tell voters how to cast their vote, because we want to make sure they have all the right information so that they can make up their minds and make their voices heard. We're not trying to influence them one way or the other about a candidate. We want them to get to know their candidates. We have an election education website called vote411.org. And last year, we supported more than 6 million American voters. And we try to make sure that we're showing every voter specific information that applies to their election. So everything down to who their local county clerk might be, for their orphan court, or who their local judge may be or sheriff. So we do the full gamut in every district, both in English and in Spanish. Their voters can also check their voter registration started. They can confirm their polling place, check the voting hours, find out if they need an ID to cast their ballot, and confirm what type of IDs are available. And these are all critical parts of making sure you can participate in an election, being an informed and educated voter. And while we want voters to have all of the information they need in every election, we also advocate for improvements to our elections when necessary. And that means we also litigate to protect voting rights. Last year, as our nation navigated the fear and the anxiety around the COVID-19 pandemic, conditions were ripe for these new threats to the democratic process. There were last-minute changes to primary elections, inconsistent voting rules, large uncertainties about the funding and operating status of the U.S. Postal Service, and that confused voters. It caused mass confusion long before Election Day. And so we, again, focused on litigation, securing and protecting options for early mail-in voting, ensuring voters had the ability to cure their ballots, expanded options for voters to exercise their right to vote safely by mail. We actually engaged in 78 lawsuits in 37 states with a 78% win rate, I might add. And so not only are we doing all of the litigation work, the advocacy work, but also building power among voters, because we want to make sure that everybody has their voice. And so those are just a few of the things that we're focusing on. We like to say we're not your grandmother's league. So we have an intergenerational group of people from 16 to 106 who all engage in this work.
Wow, that's quite an agenda, and we all find that impressive. Those of us who run for office know about the League of Women Voters at election time and your voter guides and things like that we always look forward to. But you're an extremely active organization and a very energetic organization. So thank you for your help to our community on good governance. I'm leading so many efforts globally on governance. The state of good governance in this world is declining. We see a rise, the fall of democratic institutions, and a rise of more and more oppressive governments, including in democratic states where we do not have free and fair elections. We've seen this happen over and over again, including in some of our NATO allies. So I think the work that the League of Women Voters is doing here is so important, because if America is going to be the leader for democratic values, we have to lead first by what we do here at home. So thank you both for your efforts. Jana, you issued a report entitled Fixing Our Broken Democracy, How For the People Act Would Pave the Way for Progress on the Priorities Voters Care About. Can you just tell us a little bit about that report?
Sure, happy to. And also would like to echo your endorsement, Senator Cardin, of the Vote 411 that the League of Women Voters provides. I know I used it in the last election, and I think it's a wonderful tool for folks. And so, yeah, well, happy to talk about our report, Fixing Our Broken Democracy, how the For the People Act would pave the way for progress on the priorities voters care about. And you can find that on our website at declarationforamericandemocracy.org if you want to read the whole thing in its entirety. It's a pretty interesting and quick read, so I definitely recommend checking it out. So in this report, there are countless examples of the issues and reforms that the public broadly supports, yet Congress continues to be unable to make progress on those issues. And one I would call out is gun safety, for example. 85% of Americans, including 80% of Republicans, are concerned about gun violence in this country. More than 9 in 10 Americans want universal background checks for gun purchases, and strong majorities of Americans across the political spectrum support other policies like extreme risk laws, which allow judges to temporarily remove guns from a person who is deemed to be a risk to themselves or others, a ban on people convicted of violent crimes from purchasing guns, and a mandatory 3-day waiting period for gun purchases. And in 2019, the House passed the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, H.R. 8, which would expand FBI background checks for prospective buyers, including gun shows and parking lots. But there is no action taken in the Senate. And why is that? Well, you have to follow the money, because hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by the NRA and other gun industry lobbyists. And until we can limit the influence of big moneyed interests in our politics, our partners know that we are going to continue to struggle to make meaningful progress on this issue. And even when there is half the Senate, for example, that would support, gun control laws or gun violence prevention laws, and even when the vast majority of people across the aisle support these, we don't see progress because there are certain folks and certain groups who are captured by moneyed interests. And another example would be minimum wage. Most Americans support raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. A 2019 Pew survey showed that approximately 67% of people supported such a change, and 41% strongly supported it. So that's pretty overwhelming. And there have been states and cities that have already taken action, but the federal government is falling behind. And blunting the effect of political spending could create space for lawmakers to respond to the common sense views of their constituents, allowing broadly popular provisions like the Raise the Wage Act to actually receive a vote. And provisions of the For the People Act, like those that increase disclosure of campaign spending and reinvigorate small donor matching fund systems, would offset the secret influence of money in politics. And the fact is, while big money has an iron grip on our political system, we are not going to be able to see the big changes that the vast majority of Americans support. And passing the For the People Act is a key that will unlock that opportunity for all of us.
So one of the provisions for the People's Act is to deal with disclosure of political contributions and to set up a small donor public financing type of campaign structure. So I want to take you back to 1979, my first year as Speaker of the House of the Maryland General Assembly. And I had a chance to set up an agenda. And for good governance, I had set up two major areas that I wanted to deal with. One was to enact a strong state ethics law on conflict of interest and on disclosure. The other was to set up some form of public financing of campaigns in order to minimize the importance of special interest dollars in campaigns. I worked on both of those. I was successful in my first year in passing a major state ethics law. That's still our model today, and it's been improved over time, but it was the right thing to do at the time. In 1979, legislators felt, well, this really isn't that big of a deal, campaign financing. How much costs $5,000 or $10,000 to run for a state legislative seat? You can go out and be competitive. You can do that. It's no big deal. And we were not successful in moving forward on campaign finance reform. Well, today that same legislative race may cost $500,000. When you look at how much money it costs to run for a House seat in Congress or a Senate seat in Congress, you're talking about multi-millions of dollars being spent. And we know where a lot of that money comes from. So dealing with campaign finance reform, to me, is critically important. I believe most of the people I have served with in the state legislature or here in Congress are honest people, but the system is not fair. It's not honest. It rewards, I mean, you're looking at how you set an agenda. Obviously, the ability to raise money affects how an agenda is set here in Congress. And that shouldn't be. It should be set based upon the interests of our constituents. So Virginia, the league has really been, to me, the long-stead advocate for a fair system. How critical is it for Congress to act on the way we finance campaigns?
Thanks for that question, Senator. I mean, it's critical, right? We've seen what happens when we don't have campaign finance rules in place, and it creates an equal and fair playing field, so to speak. And I have a T-shirt from the 70s, speaking of the 70s, that from one of our California leagues sent me. And it said, "Leaguers do it in public." And on the back, it says, "Open, transparency." And that's really, I think, though, something that's so critical in some of the work that you've done over the decades is creating that transparency. So even if we are going to have, we want to have fair rules in place, but we want to know where the money is coming from, right? I think that people are deserving and entitled to know where those resources are, because when money is involved, we know who's influencing decisions, how decisions are made. And I think the important part that you talked about was the amount of money it costs. We want our legislators legislating. We want our elected officials focused on serving the people, not on having to fundraise, right? So it actually allows people who are elected to do a job to do that job well, and that for people to feel heard and valued in as constituents. And so this is such a critical piece. I would also say that we've seen a lot of dark money groups who have had influence, and not knowing where the resources are coming from is frightening. It's frightening in many ways. There are too many loopholes that create holes and threats to our system that are a big part of why we've gotten where we are today. And I think we've all seen that, even leading up to January 6th.
Well, I appreciate that response, and you are correct. I can tell you, as a senator, a former member of the House, how much my colleagues, how much time they spend going to a small room known as a call room in order to make calls, dialing for dollars, when I think they would be better serving their constituents if they could be working on gun safety or working on our environment or working on improving our economy and job growth and dealing with the threats that we have, international competition. That's what we should be spending our time, not just individually, but collectively, so we're together and can resolve problems. But you can't do that if half your members are in a call room trying to raise money for their next campaign. In the House, that comes about pretty quickly with a 2-year term. So it's almost a continuous battle, particularly if you're in a seat that has been rated as competitive between Democrats and Republicans, because then you have national interest from both sides that try to get that seat. So it is a continuing problem that we see in regards to our democracy. And here's, to me, the critical point. If we don't act now, and we missed an opportunity in the 70s when we should have done this, and now we're with the system now where literally dark money, millions and millions of dollars are being funneled into elections without people knowing about it. Think of where we'll be in 10 years or 20 years from now as to how much money will be controlling our elections, and how it'll be virtually impossible for someone to break through that with just the message of why they're running for office. So it's something we really need to work on now. So going back to the 70s, or going back when we used to say, look, election day is election day, you vote on election day, and then election day shows up and there's snow on the ground, or it's raining, or a child is not feeling well and you have to take a child to the doctor, or you can't get off work, or whatever. And all of a sudden, even though you had the best intentions to vote, you're not able to vote. And sometimes it's not your fault. You're just not able to do it. Or you get interested in the election and you go to try to register and you're told, well, you had to register 2 weeks ago. And you can't do that now. These are obstacles to voting, and we have found that more vulnerable communities are more vulnerable to these circumstances. They're more likely not to be able to get off from work. It might be a single parent family, all these issues. So we've seen an evolution of early voting where individuals can pick the day they want to vote, starting a couple weeks before the election itself. That individuals can exercise their right to vote by requesting a ballot by mail and voting by mail. There are some states that do that exclusively. So we've developed this system to try to make it easier for people to be able to cast their votes. We've also passed laws to say that you can register to vote when you get your driver's license or when you a different opportunity, so it's easier to register. So before we get for the legislation that's pending in Congress today, Jana, can you just tell us what's happening in state legislatures around the nation in regards to the ability on restricting the option that a voter may have to register or vote?
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk to that. And what's happening in states across the country right now is astounding in a negative sense. It is baffling that after we saw the biggest voter turnout in modern American history, as states and people rallied and banded together to increase accessibility to the vote, that the response from Republican legislatures across the country is to decrease access to the ballot. And so there have been a spate of anti-voter bills that have been put forward across the country, and this represents nothing less than an assault on the sanctity of our democracy and a continuation of the big lie and the attack on our capital. And so 389 bills in 48 states have been introduced just this legislative session. And as of May 14th, 14 states have passed 22 new laws to restrict access to the ballot box, and more are still likely to come, with 61 bills currently moving through legislatures in 18 states. And many of these laws do, in fact, focus on preventing people of color from voting, disabled voters, seniors. It is going to have a disproportionate impact on these folks, and oftentimes it's intentionally made that way. For example, in Arizona, they recently repealed and removed the permanent early voting list. That allows people who have signed up to vote to receive an absentee ballot and to vote early every year. But now, if they do not cast a ballot at least once every 2 years, they'll no longer be on that list. And people who expect to get a ballot and don't know about these changes may miss their opportunity to vote in the coming years. And I think no voter restriction laws have been so egregious as to those that we've seen in Georgia. So we know incredibly restricting laws have been passed in Georgia, deliberately targeting Black communities. As we know, Georgia turned blue this year because so many people turned out to vote. And the fact is, after losing on the national stage, the response from Republican legislatures is not to be, excited about the historic voter turnout and to look within their ideology to see how they are appealing to most Americans, but to instead try to rig the system so people can't exercise their right to vote is very telling. And it's important to note in Georgia that numerous, and this was in 2020 election even, numerous polling places in Georgia were shut down in this past election, especially in Black communities, causing incredibly long lines. And recent laws that have been passed has now criminalized giving food and water to people who are waiting in line. And that not only targets Black Americans, but also disabled Americans and older Americans who, because polling places have been shut down, are going to be forced to wait in increasingly long lines. And we know people waited in lines up to 8 hours. And so they will be unable to receive food or water from volunteers. And I'll just add one more component. We had a huge turnout this past year because we expanded the ability for people to vote by mail. And right now, many of the bills being considered, these anti-voter bills that are being considered are to restrict vote by mail options and opportunities. So some of those include making it more difficult for people to cast their mail-in ballots, period. Shorten the time frame to request a mail-in ballot, not allowing people to automatically receive their ballot, like the removal from the permanent early voting list, making it more difficult to deliver their ballot by limiting drop box availability, and shortening the windows for return. And we know that in some states, for example, you need a witness signature on your mail-in ballot or even a notary to make your ballot valid. And these are not options for people that are accessible. And this is happening across the country. And the For the People Act will go a long way to stopping these anti-voter laws.
My guest today on Facebook Live, Voting Rights for the People, Jana Morgan, the director of the Declaration for American Democracy, and Virginia Kase, Solomon, the CEO of the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is active not only at the national level, but also at our local levels. In a democratic state, when you lose an election, you try to win the next one. And I have backed candidates that have not been successful. I tried to understand why we weren't as successful as we should have been and try to reach out to appeal to voters so that we can win the next election. That's what democracies are about. Autocratic countries, they don't let their voters make those decisions. They try to control who can participate in an election. That's not what democracy is about. So to me, it's fundamental to make sure we get the widest possible participation in elections. And we do not try to rig it so that those who vote for us have an easier time than those who are perhaps not as sympathetic to our political position. From the League of Women Voters perspective, you've worked at state legislative levels as well as the national level. This must be a real challenge for you to see what's happening around the nation. Virginia.
Yeah, it has been. I think the frustrating thing, once again, is just the fact that these are democratic ideals and norms that we have always subscribed to as a nation, right? That everybody should have the right to vote. There were people who have lost their lives to be able to benefit from the right to vote, whether it was, passage of the 19th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act. We thought we had arrived, so to speak. And we had protections in place. Once the Voting Rights Act was gutted in the Shelby v. Holder decision, it removed preclearance. It did a lot of things. And that's where we really started to see a lot of these challenges start to arise. So this wasn't just with the most recent administration. This has been happening for several years. And so we've seen these attacks popping up on democracy, on the practice of voting. And so at the League, we have tried to do as much as we can to make sure that we are helping to advance voter access across the country in every state. We are fortunate. We have close to 800 leagues in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, hopefully the 51st state. And so being able to make sure that there is access to the ballot. But these attacks on voting rights, they are not new. And I think that that's something that we need to make sure that people are aware of, because oftentimes people aren't paying attention until they get to the voting booth and realize that they've been purged from a list, or they're not really noticing what's happening because they're just taking care of their day-to-day responsibilities as people living their lives. But then they go and they realize that somehow they've put in their ballot, and now their ballot wasn't accepted because the signature didn't match, because somebody maybe got their driver's license and automatically registered to vote when they were in their mid 60s, and when the last time they took out a driver's license, and now they have MS. And their signature is shaky, for example, right? There are all of these challenges that people face. And so one of the things that we think is really important, in addition to fighting for access for voters, is making sure that voters have the information to know what these laws are, and to help build power among voters so that they feel that they have the right to go and speak to their legislators and demand that access that they are entitled to.
Well, thank you for that. There are two provisions that are in the For the People Act that I authored that I want to at least mention. One came out of my experience in the 2006 senatorial race that I was involved in. And then 2 years later in the gubernatorial elections, or I guess 4 years later in the gubernatorial elections, we had a similar episode. The episode that happened in my election was that on the day before the election, a piece was circulated in the African American community that indicated my opponent had the endorsement of key African American leaders. In fact, these key African American leaders had endorsed me. And we did everything we could to correct the record, but this was put out the day before the election in an apparent effort to either confuse the African American vote or to diminish the African American vote. The second thing that happened was a robocall that went out in our community, again targeted to African Americans, who said the election is sent late in the afternoon of the election and said, don't worry about voting. We already have enough votes to win. There's no need for you to come out to vote. In both of those cases, it was a challenge as to whether it violated any laws or not. So HR 1S1 tries to deal with deceptive practices that are aimed at diminishing minority votes. The second provision I just really want to mention is Democracy Restoration Act, which is something we really need to deal with. In some states, if you've committed a felony, and their definitions of felonies can be pretty broad, anytime in your lifetime, there's a lifetime prohibition from you ever being able to cast a vote. Lifetime. Even though you've paid your price to society, you're back as a full citizen, but yet you have no ability to vote in future elections. This again has been targeted against minority communities. In one state, 1 out of every 5 African American eligible voters are not eligible to vote because of this restriction. There are differences among states. We have some states that have full voting protection even while you're serving incarcerated. There's other states like Maryland where you have full restoration of voting rights after you have served your prison time. And then there are states that have a lifetime prohibition. The For the People Act provides for a national floor that once you've served your time, you are eligible to cast a vote. I mentioned those two bills because part of For the People Act is to get even more people engaged in voting and to eliminate as a campaign strategy an effort to target a minority community to confuse or diminish their votes. I think they're both very, very important. But I want to get on to the subject that I know the League of Women Voters is going to have a very strong view about, and that's gerrymandering. Now, here, I told you offline, make sure we don't go too far in the partisan direction here today with the League of Women Voters here, because I know you're nonpartisan. So I remember receiving pretty critical accounts from the League of Women Voters on the redistricting procedures in the state of Maryland when we drew our congressional lines. So talk a little bit about how gerrymandering has just gotten off the charts as far as diminishing the importance of communities to maximize partisan gain in legislative bodies. Let's start this time with Virginia.
Thanks. Well, this is definitely something. We had a Supreme Court case 2 years ago, Russo versus the League of Women Voters. We joined with Common Cause on that one as well, and we lost. We've seen time and time again the packing and cracking of districts to do one of two things: to either dilute the vote or to make sure that politicians get to choose their voters. Right. And so we've seen it time and time again. And for the league, for decades, we've been involved with the redistricting process. Yes, both parties do it. We know that some do it more than others. But what we've seen, especially in the Russo case, was just, it was so egregious. It was so egregious. It was blatant. People aren't even hiding it anymore, quite frankly, which is something that really frustrates us. And so we had that case particular, we were looking for something to say, what is too much gerrymandering? We know it's going to happen a little bit, right? It's a political process and there are always lines. But we were looking for the court for a remedy, and they were unwilling or unable to give us one. I think with the Voting Rights Act being gutted, one of the things that for us, especially in this next redistricting cycle, that that gives us a lot of anxiety is this is going to be the first time we're going through a redistricting cycle without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And the other thing that's scary is because there was a green light basically to move forward with partisan gerrymandering, we are fearful that we will see racial gerrymandering disguised as partisan gerrymandering, right? So there are all of these concerns that we have. And so one of the solutions that the League has put forward is citizens redistricting commissions, where you have people from both parties, people from their communities and independents who come together to draw fair maps. For us, we see this as a great opportunity to have citizens engaged and to make sure that it's fair. We don't, yes, both of the parties have at times been upset with us for the position that we take in, but for the League, it's really always about fairness. What is fair for the people who are impacted by these decisions, and how much involvement are people who are impacted a part of the redistricting process? But we are very fearful this time, Senator, and I think the Voting Rights Act is part of S1. It is also the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They are not one and the same. They are part and parcel. They work as a complement in a complementary way. But this is the first time we will not have those full protections, and so we are really concerned about what these maps will look like, because we know that there are some states some politicians who don't win on ideas, right? And so they will entrench themselves in power. And so we are encouraging folks to really get engaged and understand what's happening, especially with the census data having come out. And we know that there were challenges there. And so we really want to make sure that citizens are as engaged and involved in this process as possible in a fair way. And one thing I will say, we are nonpartisan. It doesn't mean that we're not political. We have lots of political opinions as an organization. And having fair maps is one of them.
Senator Cardin, can I give a quick follow-up?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Sure. So one thing I just want to promote is that the urgency of the For the People Act, S1 being passed this summer, speaking directly to the gerrymandering question, as Virginia just mentioned, the maps are being redrawn, right now. We just did the census, and so these maps are going to be in place for 10 years. And so the For the People Act, which would set up nonpartisan commissions that would include Republicans, Democrats, independents, to redraw the district lines in a fair way, that needs to be passed by the end of the summer in order to have that impact, to ensure that these lines are drawn in a fair way that adequately represents the people of this country and ensures them strong representation.
Jana, in fair disclosure, let me point out that in Maryland, the Democrats control a good part of the process, not all, because the governor has a lot to say about this, but the Democrats certainly control the legislature. And I strongly support that provision in the For the People Act, having a citizen-controlled, nonpartisan commission draw these lines. If you look at some recent elections for the House of Representatives, when the Republicans controlled the speakership because they had more members, when you look at the votes that were cast, many more votes were cast for Democrats than Republicans for the House of Representatives. But the way that redistricting was done, the fact that so many state legislatures were controlled by Republicans that did partisan redistricting, that they carved it in a way where they could have a higher representation than their numbers would normally allow. So maybe in one election it will benefit one party over another, but in every election you are disadvantaging the community from having its input and proper representation. So let's do what's right for the people, and let's make sure that we include this congressional redistricting commission in the legislation we enact. Well, both of you have mentioned the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is to respond to the Shelby County decision of the Supreme Court in 2013 dealing with pre-clearance. So this is a separate bill, an important bill. It complements, as you said, Virginia, the For the People Act. Talk a little bit with me, and we'll start with Jana. Talk a little bit with me the importance of restoring the pre-clearance.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Happy to cover that. And so, I think it's important for folks to understand the difference between the two bills and what each bill does. And so the For the People Act, which is S1, would set a national baseline standard for voting rights end partisan gerrymandering, and get big money out of politics. And so it will also act as kind of a sword to cut down the anti-voter laws that are happening across the country. And now the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 4, is critical as well, because what it will do is restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And what happened in that Shelby County v. Holder Supreme Court case is the requirement for certain states that had a history of racist anti-voter laws, they would have to get pre-clearance from the federal government before passing new laws. Now that pre-clearance provision was struck down. And so H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, would restore that pre-clearance provision and hopefully expand the formula of states that are covered. And that would prevent anti-voter laws from being passed in the future. So it would act as a kind of shield. And so that's how we kind of talk about it as H.R. 1, the For the People Act, is the sword, and the H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, is the shield to stop future anti-voter laws from being passed. And as we can see, I mean, there has never been a greater need. The 2016 election and 2020 were the first presidential elections since the civil rights era without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And we've seen hundreds of anti-voter laws, many that are racist in nature, that have now been introduced, and some have been passed in states across the country.
So Virginia, do we need both?
Oh, absolutely. Jana couldn't have said it any better. They are both so critical. They are complementary and both really, really necessary. I think one of the things that we also, a myth that we have to debunk, so to speak, is that that these attacks are only happening in the South, or that these attacks are only happening. We've seen an explosion of attacks on voting rights. And it is something that is so necessary for every state in this country to make sure that there is full access. And I think, you know, for so many of us, John Lewis was a hero. We have had the privilege of working with him, and what a better way to honor his legacy than to see his life work and that of so many others. We can't allow ourselves to be taken back to the era of Jim Crow. And that's exactly what will happen if we don't have these measures in place. And so absolutely, they're both necessary, Senator. I think you probably know that better than anybody else.
Yes, and of course, I strongly disagreed with the Supreme Court decision. But the Supreme Court decision said, Congress, now do your job and update the information and go ahead with pre-clearance, just update it. It wasn't saying pre-clearance was wrong. It was saying that the standards that were used initially in 1965 need to be updated. So let's update it. Let's do what we need to do and get that pre-clearance back into the code so that we can enforce a Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1965 to protect voting rights. You would think that now we would want to advance voting rights, not to go back to how it was prior to 1965 in our country. It was 1987, my first year in the House of Representatives, and my classmate was John Lewis. We became dear friends. And what an opportunity I had to have him as a colleague and a friend and as advisor. And we had a lot of good times together, and we fought a lot of campaigns together. But he felt that voting rights was perhaps the most important of all of his causes. That it was, as Jana, you said in the beginning, it enables us to have policies that reflect the will of the people, which is what our democracy is all about. And if we don't do that, then everything else falls. And I have the opportunity today to be the chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, which deals with human rights and good governance globally, with particular reference to Europe, Central Asia, and North America. And I can tell you, we are really being challenged today. So before we leave redistricting, I've got to at least put in a plug for the United States Senate. I've been accused that I ran for the United States Senate, said they couldn't change my district around through redistricting because of the state lines. There's some truth to that, by the way. But the challenge here, of course, is that we cannot change the state lines, nor do we want to change the state lines. But the great compromise that formed the United States gives every state 2 U.S. senators, despite their size. So the makeup currently, in this day in the United States Senate, is going to reflect an overbalance of the central states, which are more likely to be Republican than Democrats. So it makes it even more challenging right now. Democrats have clearly won the majority of votes for the United States Senate over and over again, but yet have struggled to get the majority of United States senators in the Senate. And of course, we also have the anomaly of the Electoral College on electing the President of the United States, where we've had several examples where the President has received less popular votes than electoral votes who have been elected president. So there are fundamental challenges in our system, but congressional redistricting is an area that we can deal with. So let's talk about timing. We have a few minutes remaining. Good point. If we don't get this done soon, the 2022 elections will be taking place in Maryland. We have very, very important elections for Congress, for U.S. Senator, for the governor, statewide officers, our state legislators, and for our county governments. And if we don't pass this bill shortly, it will be virtually impossible to implement those changes in time for the 2022 elections. And as you point out, if we don't enact it now, the redistricting that will be done, we'll have to wait a decade before we can do anything more about that. So how urgent is it that we get down to business and get this done?
I think, yeah.
Go ahead, Virginia, please.
Well, I think Jana and I are both, I mean, we were at a rally up on Capitol Hill just yesterday in the 90+ degree heat with many of your colleagues calling for this exact moment. It needs to happen. Our democracy is in crisis, and I'm not an alarmist. I think one of the things that I will say is that, there's that saying, hindsight is 20/20, right? We don't need hindsight to know that we need to fix things now because of this election, because of all of that we've seen, the stress that our democracy has gone under. And this will allow us to have a clean path forward that puts everybody on an even playing field. But time is of the essence. We know that we don't have the time because of redistricting. We don't have the luxury to wait. We need to move those things now. And so I'm really glad that you're emphasizing that. And Jana, I please ask you to piggyback on that.
No, absolutely. Senator Cardin and Virginia, I just couldn't have said it better myself. Really, we are at a pivotal moment. We are at a crossroads. We are at a decision point for our democracy. Are we going to let people who want to prevent folks from voting tear down our democracy, tear down the right to vote, or are we going to take action in this moment when we are called to? And history will look back on us, and I hope that they will say we worked hard enough and we fought hard enough and that we achieved passage of the For the People Act, because we will not stop partisan gerrymandering for the next 10 years without it. And we will not have voter protections in place in time for the next election cycle unless we pass it this summer. And I would add one more thing that I think is important for everyone to recognize, which is, even though there are no Senate Republicans that have joined this bill, and we would welcome them if they also believe in protecting the right to vote, and we would welcome that, it's really critical to understand that 8 in 10 Americans support the For the People Act. This is a wildly popular bill, wildly popular piece of legislation, and that includes majorities of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. This is a bipartisan bill. This is an American bill, and it's one that will help restore the power and the esteem of American democracy by protecting people's rights to vote and getting big money out of politics. And it must be passed this summer.
There's nothing more fundamental than protecting the right to vote. So I couldn't agree with you more. And Congress has a responsibility to act on this issue. It's an historic moment and a historic opportunity. The United States Senate has been called the greatest deliberative body in the world. You would think this important subject that every senator would agree, let's have a full Senate debate on the issue. Let us take up amendments. Let us vote on amendments that show the people of this country where we stand on any one of the issues we've talked about that's included in For the People Act or the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Let's have both of them on the floor of the United States Senate. Let's have a process where senators can offer amendments, debate those amendments, and let the majority of senators make a decision as to whether those amendments should rise or fall. At the end of the day, let's take a vote. And so hope to have a majority of senators on record to protect the basic voting rights of the people of this nation. That's the way the United States Senate should operate. But today we are stuck with the filibuster problems. It's an issue that I know Senator Schumer is trying to deal with. I can tell you that our caucus is trying to deal with that issue. I'm old-fashioned. I believe that majority rule should rule in elections. I mean, elections have consequences. And I am romantic in the United States Senate. I remember growing up watching all the movies about Mr. Smith going to Washington. I do believe in the debate in the floor of the United States Senate and voting on issues and standing up for principle. So many of us are going to continue to do this fight. I admire people who have literally given their lives and are continuing to give their lives around the world for the right to vote, for democratic principles. As we are conducting this show, there are protests taking place in Belarus and in Russia and in China, where people are literally putting their lives at risk in order to get that precious right of determining their own government. Here in the United States, we can speak out. We don't have to worry about our safety, but we should be fighting to make sure that every person has the right to participate in a free and fair election. And that's what this debate is about. And the Senate has a responsibility to make sure that we have that debate and that vote on the floor of the United States Senate. And if we do, I'm optimistic that For the People will survive and we'll get the voting rights protection and we'll restore the preclearance on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Let me thank both of our guests and for all of you joining us today. Jana Morgan, the director of the Declaration for American Democracy, Virginia Kase Solomon, the CEO of the League of Women Voters. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back in a week or two with the next subject. We'll see what's going on at that time. Everybody stay safe. And again, thank you for being with us.